Last time in this series, when I talked about ranked choice voting, I made sure to emphasize that while changing our procedure for voting and counting votes would help address some problems, it would not fix everything that's wrong with our electoral system. That system has some serious flaws that make it far more difficult for people, particularly people in marginalized groups, to exercise their right to vote. Working to correct those flaws is what has brought former Georgia House of Representatives member Stacey Abrams to national prominence. In 2018, Abrams unsuccessfully ran for governor of Georgia against Republican Brian Kemp. An independent investigation found that Kemp, who was the Georgia Secretary of State during his gubernatorial candidacy, wrongfully invalidated the registrations of hundreds of thousands of voters. Since losing the election, Abrams has become a leader in the fight against voter suppression. Get out the vote efforts led by Abrams have also been credited in assisting Joe Biden to become the first Democratic presidential candidate to win Georgia since 1992, as well as making the difference for Democratic candidates Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff as they won both of the state's U.S. Senate seats, allowing the Democrats to take control of the Senate. Get out the vote drives leading to large voter turnout can help to counteract voter suppressive policies, but to really address the problem, we need to do more than encourage people to vote. We need to identify and change those policies that are creating barriers between voters and their ability to vote in the first place. When we talk about voter suppression, we're not talking about just one law, policy, or strategy. Voter suppression can refer to any situation that discourages or even prevents people from voting. And because of the way we conduct elections in the United States, most voter suppression originates at the state level. While federal statute requires that presidential elections must take place on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November, the actual administration of the elections is left to individual states. Different states have different policies and procedures for running elections, and some of those policies and procedures result in, and in many cases are there for the purpose of, voter suppression. For example, 36 states require voters to provide identification before their vote is counted. 6 states have a strict photo ID requirement, which can be a problem for eligible voters who don't have an acceptable form of photo ID. People of color and voters living on low incomes are more likely to lack such identification, which means they are more likely to be unable to vote as a result of such laws. Some states also don't accept student IDs as a valid form of identification, which disenfranchises many younger voters. All of these groups tend to favor more progressive candidates, and Native Americans who live on reservations have long found it difficult to obtain government-issued IDs, which is part of the reason why, according to this article published on the website of the American Bar Association last year, Native Americans have the lowest voter turnout of any demographic group. States can also suppress the vote by limiting the number and locations of polling places or the hours those polling places are open. In 2013, the Republican-controlled state legislature of North Carolina passed a law that reduced the number of days of early voting. That law was challenged in court and eventually struck down when judges found that the Republican lawmakers had studied data on voting trends and crafted legislation that disproportionately affected black voters. That attempt at voter suppression was fairly sophisticated compared to some of the more infamous historical examples. Following the passage of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, white legislators throughout the former Confederacy, frightened by high turnout among black voters, instituted poll taxes and literacy tests which were deliberately targeted to block black Americans from voting. Those are fairly obvious examples, but some forms of voter suppression are more subtle. Voting rights advocates often voice concerns over large purges of names from voter registration rolls. It's the subject of a lawsuit related to the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, as I mentioned earlier. But it's not just Georgia. The Brennan Center for Justice estimates that from 2014 to 2016, nearly 16 million names were removed from voter rolls nationwide. It's important to note that the purging of names from voter rolls is a necessary process. There are legitimate reasons to do it. Voters die or move to another district. The rolls need to be updated occasionally, and that updating includes removing people who are no longer eligible. But this process can also be subject to error, resulting in voters who are rightfully still eligible being removed. In Ohio in 2019, 40,000 names that were removed from the rolls as part of a purge had to be added back because it was found they were taken off by mistake. The purging process can also be abused as a partisan tool. Politicians, almost always Republicans, sometimes claim that the voter rolls need to be purged more often and more extensively in order to prevent voter fraud. In fact, most forms of voter suppression are justified at one time or another as attempts to prevent voter fraud. The problem is, while voter suppression policies threaten the voting rights of millions of people, voter fraud isn't actually much of a problem. All evidence indicates that the danger of voter fraud affecting the outcome of an election is like weedsy. For another example of a less blatant form of voter suppression, this past April, the ACLU sued the state of Georgia on behalf of the group Black Voters Matter over the state requiring voters who request mail-in absentee ballots to pay for their own postage. It might not seem like a big deal, but requiring a voter to pay in order to exercise their right to vote could be seen as a poll tax, whether it's intended as such or not. And poll taxes are banned by the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Just last week, Georgia Public Radio reported that Republican lawmakers had introduced 8 bills to the state legislature, which, if enacted, would make it more difficult for voters to obtain absentee ballots, ban the use of drop boxes as a way to return ballots, and end automatic voter registration. So, yeah. Voter suppression is very much a problem today and has been an ongoing problem throughout the history of the United States. But until relatively recently, it was at least a lot more difficult to get away with. In 2013, the United States Supreme Court gutted the pre-clearance clause of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which requires that certain jurisdictions obtain federal permission before changing their election laws, and showed that the proposed changes would not have a discriminatory effect. Without pre-clearance, jurisdictions with long histories of discriminatory electoral practices, particularly in the former Jim Crow South, have begun to reestablish those practices. In 2013 and 2014 alone, 10 states passed new laws restricting voting rights, mostly by establishing new voter ID requirements, reducing early voting, or making it more difficult to register to vote. Obviously, reviewing election laws that have been passed since 2013, especially in areas that would have been subject to pre-clearance, is a good place to start when it comes to doing something about voter suppression. The Brennan Center for Justice has been tracking state voting laws every year since 2012, and it's an excellent resource to see if your state has recently enacted or is currently considering laws that make it more difficult for people to vote. The link to that is in the description. If your state has such laws, they would make an excellent subject for an email or a phone call to your representatives in your state legislature. But ending voter suppression will require more than repealing harmful election laws. I think we need to establish a nationwide set of norms and expectations that make it as easy as possible for all eligible voters to vote. And I think we need to encourage everyone who can vote to vote in every election. Broadly speaking, in terms of policy, there are 2 things we can push for right now to help make that happen: expanded access to voting by mail and automatic voter registration. 34 states and the District of Columbia offer no-excuse absentee voting. 5 of those states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, mail ballots to all eligible voters automatically, and in the others, voters can request a mail-in ballot without having to provide an excuse for why they can't vote in person. The National Conference of State Legislatures maintains an online resource listing the voting procedures throughout the country. It's linked in the description of this video. If your state is isn't one that offers automatic or no excuse absentee voting, contact your state legislators and tell them you think it's a good idea. Because it's a good idea. Not only does voting by mail make it easier for people who are unable to wait in line at a polling place on election day to vote, which is an excellent reason to do it, there's really no reason to not do it. Like I said, 5 states conduct elections by mail already, and it works fine. Last year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of Americans voted by mail for the first time, including me, and it was fine. In fact, I'm probably going to vote by mail from now on because it's easy and I'm lazy or busy. Take your pick. In-person voting is great for people who have the opportunity to do it, and as long as there isn't, a global outbreak of a deadly disease, you get the experience of actually physically participating in democracy. The poll workers are happy to see you, at least in my experience, hopefully in yours too. There's a welcoming, celebratory feel to it. They hand you your ballot, you go to the booth, you fill it out, you place it in the scanner or drop it in the box or however it works where you are, and when you're done, they hand you a sticker. It's the shit. But even so, I see no reason why any eligible voter shouldn't be able to request a mail-in ballot for every election for any reason. Many attempts at voter suppression come in the form of closing polling places or limiting their operating hours or reducing the hours and numbers of early voting locations. These reductions are often justified by citing concerns about the cost or the difficulty in finding volunteers to staff them. Encouraging voters to vote by mail takes care of a lot of that. It's still necessary to collect and count mail-in ballots, of course, but it reduces the burden on in-person polling places, particularly on Election Day. So, if officials who support reductions to in-person polling places are truly motivated by budgetary and staffing considerations, they should be all for expanding voting by mail. Right? They should also be in favor of automatic voter registration. Unless they don't want every eligible voter in their state to be registered, of course, but why would anyone not want that? I sure can't think of a good reason. 20 states and the District of Columbia have either implemented or are about to implement some form of automatic voter registration. In these states, eligible voters who interact with the Department of Motor Vehicles are automatically registered to vote. That makes sense, because the information you provide to the DMV in order to apply for or renew a driver's license or register a car is the same information you need to provide in order to register to vote. Your name, your date of birth, your citizenship, where you live, the basic stuff. If you've already given that information to the state for one purpose, why shouldn't the state also use that information for another, even more important purpose, arguably the most important and fundamental purpose for which a democratic government collects personal info about its citizens, enabling citizens to vote? As part of its aforementioned resource of voting procedures, the National Conference of State Legislatures has a list of which states have automatic voter registration and which don't. If your state is one of the 30 states that does not currently have a form of automatic voter registration in place or in the works, you should contact your representatives about that too. Expanding mail-in voting and automatic registration so they apply to eligible voters nationwide would go a long way toward counteracting the voter suppression policies that have been put in place throughout the country, but mostly in the South, almost exclusively by Republicans. But there's still more we can do. Most election laws are enacted and enforced at the state level, but that doesn't mean there's no role here for the federal government. There are plenty of things we can and should be pestering our members of Congress about, too. For example, Congress could make Election Day a national holiday. That wouldn't mean that everyone got the day off work to go vote, unfortunately, especially low-wage workers, but it would make it a lot easier for a lot more people to vote on Election Day. Congress could also provide additional federal funding to states that expand voting by mail and early voting, increase the number of polling places, and extend the hours those polling places are open. I don't mean to suggest that Congress hasn't done that sort of thing before. It has. I just think it should do it again and keep doing it until this is no longer a problem. The federal government helping states foot the bill would make it a lot harder to argue that reduced hours and poll closures are motivated by anything other than a partisan desire to suppress the votes of a particular segment of the electorate. The history of the United States is fraught with examples of those in power attempting to keep their power by blocking the people from exercising their constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. Usually, those people in power are predominantly, if not entirely, white, and those they are seeking to disenfranchise are predominantly, if not entirely, black and brown. Voter suppression is just one element of the legacy of slavery and the reality of white supremacy that we all live with and which we are all responsible for dismantling. That's too big a job for any one of us to do alone or to be completed in a single lifetime, but ending or at least significantly reducing voter suppression is one aspect of that job that we can accomplish in the foreseeable future. Enough of us just have to work together to make sure that the ability to vote freely and easily is a part of where we go from here.